Hi, my name is Gigi Ferries. I will be doing a demographic presentation on Curtis Middle School in Wichita, Kansas. Curtis is located in a neighborhood, and you can see the buildings here. I will talk about that a little bit later. But it was built back in 1953 in what was a fairly common practice at the time, which was to try and build basically a campus. When possible, there is an elementary school to the south of Curtis Middle School, which at that time was a junior high, and what was at that time Southeast High School, which was completed a couple of years later in like 1957, but has since been turned into the administrative building for USC 259. Southeast built a brand new building and they moved. It's approximately 6.5 miles away, which is an issue in and of itself. But having our administrative buildings across the parking lot has definitely been an advantage for me, as I'll bring up later in this presentation. Enrollment at Curtis is increasing. If you go on the internet, you can essentially find numbers in the 700s. In May of this past year, we had 869, and at the end of August of this new school year, we had over 900. While the numbers have slightly changed, the demographic percentages have relatively stayed the same. It's almost split half and half between males and females. One of the biggest things to note is the percentage of economically disadvantaged, which is at 91% plus for our building versus the district and the state. Curtis is also incredibly multicultural. It has a very large population of African Americans, and as well as Caucasian students, Hispanic students, and other ethnicities. We don't have any recorded migrant students, but the key here in looking at this information is looking at the number of English as language learners. Our percentage is incredibly high at Curtis, as is our number of students with disabilities, which I will discuss later. This large ELL percentage is due primarily to the fact that Curtis is the host for the newcomer program in Wichita, which means that any student approximately within the age of middle school age children 10 to 14 who is new to the country begins their public school education at Curtis. How does that compare to other schools? Most other middle schools at about our size have 1 to 2 ESOL designated classroom. Curtis has over 6. And a large portion of our current newcomers are actually from Tanzania, Kenya, other East Coast African countries, as well as from Central America and some other Arabic speaking countries. And while English is the primary language spoken at home, many of our students speak more than two languages at home, with parents often having a stilted or limited English speaking background. The staff of Curtis is organized into teams, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, as well as a team for exploratory, a team for categorical, and other SPED students or special education students, and then our newcomers / ESOL and staff. Generally speaking, each team has an opportunity for, out of the 10 hours of the day, have one period that's designated specifically for team and professional development time, and as well as another period that is designated for planning. I think that last year when we went on a block schedule, there were some huge advantages to the scheduling and working in that time frame, as well as developing new and interesting information and presentations and device knowledge for our remote kids. as well as bonding between the teachers and getting to know one another. This year has been it's been off to a slow start. There's an enormous lag time between the rollout of the iPads that we were awarded through a school grant and the start of school. In fact, this coming Wednesday is when students will be receiving their iPads and training on them. But what that has meant is that from August 12th until this time, this September 8th, we've not been able to really use any devices, or they've been very limited, usually to the language arts teachers in the building. And that has created some difficulties. I know in my own class teaching drama, in terms of student engagement, informal assessments, and being able to have some one-on-one time with the students. So we're missing a large number of these applications that we found last year during COVID. The other thing that we're noticing as far as the climate is concerned in our building is just a huge regression in the form of impulse control, social skills, focus, and respect coming from our students. As well as an uptick in aggression and frustration. 17 school days into the school year, and we've already had a half a dozen out-of-school suspensions, as well as a number of in-school suspensions. I think that this pretty much sums up the climate for our school at the moment. While we're good at making lemonade out of the lemons, there's too many of them. Wichita is an interesting community in terms of the size, which is fairly large at 400,000 if you count the surrounding areas, but also because of how innovative and entrepreneurial this city is. There's a lot of things going on in Wichita. Has one of the top ranking high schools in the United States, and yet it still manages to operate like a rather large town. Unlike the demographic percentages at Curtis, Wichita is made up primarily of Caucasians, running close to 75%, 10.9 African American percent, and then 5% Asian and 17.2% Hispanic. If you look at the map that I showed earlier, one of the things that you'll notice is the housing and the size. These are very small homes. Most of them were built in 1941 as temporary war housing for manufacturers that had come to help building the airplanes or for military training. They were not meant to be used 80 years later. So many of them are run down and in poor shape and were not particularly made well to begin with. Furthermore, if you continue to look at the neighborhood where Curtis is located, the statistics on average income for the zip code, it covers this area here. Most of my students live in this area. Some of them live to the south in Hilltop and Longview. And while it states that the average income is around $40,000 a year in a household, that is not particularly accurate as far as the families at Curtis are concerned. There's a hugely large wealth population here in College Hill and even in Crown Heights that bumps the average income quite a bit. Most of the homes that are lived in by the students are actually rented as opposed to owned, and there's far fewer working adults in the home, and the average income tends to be about $20,000 a year. We have placed in the bottom 50% of the schools for overall test scores, especially math proficiency and reading, and it is quite a bit lower than the state average. The data on the science is very similar to that as the language arts and the math. There are no history or government statistics in the KSDE report card for Curtis Middle School because it is a middle school. One of the things that I do find intriguing about Curtis. So they do use what is typically a multi-tier system of supports for students, IPSPs, which are individuals problem-solving processes, dynamic learning maps, IEPs, graphic organizers, accommodations, just a wide variety of teaching and assessment modalities in order to meet the needs of the students. Our report card states that 70% of the student body at Curtis is classified as having a disability. That's a little misleading. There's an amazing subset of students on IEPs that are deaf or hearing impaired. And the majority of those students are mainstreamed into regular classrooms. And there's a lot of support as far as paras are concerned, the availability of paras for IEPs, for interrelated classrooms, for categorical classrooms, and the like. The difficulty lies in what used to be 10, 15 years ago, a subset of IEP students that would have been categorized as behavior disordered, or in today's language, emotional disorder or emotional disturbance. We don't see that classification very often anymore. The IPSP, which is the individual problem-solving process, which I mentioned earlier, has been developed as probably a stopgap from the number of children being placed into a BD classification on an IEP. And that's wonderful, and there's a lot of benefits to that. But the downside to that is that those numbers don't count in the statistics when determining the number of disabled students in the building, which then also cuts down on the amount of monies that we have available to us for paras. As a result, you may have a classroom with an incredibly large percentage of these IPSP students and no support staff, no paras, or anyone in the building that can help with that. And so that has become an issue for some teachers, especially for the exploratory teachers, of which I am one, which I will discuss in my reflection. I think that while the staff is quite good at letting us know about the IEPs and the accommodations and the other needs of our students, the IPSP kids, we historically don't get a whole lot of information about those kids. So that one's a little bit hit and miss. It's not as easily accessible, and it's not as easy to find for the teachers who like me really want to get in there and try and find out information on these kids. On reflection, the videos that we watched were really quite good, and I really enjoy the fact that we have a very diverse population at Curtis Middle School. The downside is that I don't see Curtis doing a particularly good job at celebrating those newcomers. Unlike East High School, which has just an incredibly diverse population with flags and clubs for all the different nationalities and cultures, there isn't anything like that at Curtis. Although I do believe that there are magnets or specialized program in some of the neighborhood schools that do allow for some of that. We do not have it at Curtis. And as such, we aren't given any information as teachers in terms of just some basic things like how do I ask them what their name is in their language. So fitting into the areas of which I do have some control, I'm hoping to further create a lesson plan or a unit that I've already been working on that looks at fairy tales and folk tales, not just from an American point of view, but from countries and cultures all over the world. Most of my students aren't even aware of the most common fairy tales that I grew up with, unless it's been made into big budget film. And so I don't see any reason to expand on that, and have found some amazing short drama pieces on folk tales from other cultures, South America, Africa. So I'm going to continue to broaden that, which will be one of the ways in which I want to continue to diversify my own students, honor them and their culture, learn about their culture, as well as allow other classmates to learn as well. As far as my own background, I think the fact that I have a master's in social work and was a grief counselor for a number of years, and have dealt with some very common or universals, such as death, and have really learned that there is such a broad, rich availability of variables for what is considered a proper way to manage, say, what a family does when someone passes away, has really broadened my expertise. I'm constantly curious, and enjoy asking my students about all kinds of things, from the food that they eat to the clothing to everything, and let them ask the same questions of me. I am going to end this presentation on a little bit of a negative note. Well, I've seen during my advent of educational lifetime, institutionalized individuals being then in self-contained rooms, to mainstreaming, to the IEP classifications being broadened, and so on and so forth, which I think is all wonderful. I think the one thing that has not occurred is a reduction in class size that allows teachers to go from a more universal form of teaching to a more variability in terms of trying to impact and be successful with their students. My case in point is my 9th hour drama class, which currently is down to 39 from 46. Of that 39, 9 of them are categorical students, only which 2 of them are verbal. 2 pairs come to the classroom with them, but they come with no pencils or supplies and without any technology, because, as I said, the iPads have not been distributed. And so it's been very difficult to provide them with instruction. I essentially have to create an entirely different lesson plan for them. And they come with because they come with no pencils or no supplies, it's very easy to assume that they're not really there for me to teach, but to babysit, which is highly frustrating. I have found ways to interact with a couple of them who are verbal, been able to show some things, some pictures and videos off of my iPad with the help of a para to teach some other things, but don't really have the ability to sit down with them and really pay attention to them, in part because the rest of my class of 30 students, there are 8 of them on IPSPs, 6 of them with significant behavioral issues in the classroom. 7 of my students, and there may be overlapping, are English as a second language. There are 4 on less restrictive IEPs, including a traumatic brain injury student in the classroom. When I complained about this, I was essentially told that there was nowhere else for these students to go, and that 40 students isn't that bad. And that just basically spread the behavior problems around. The difficulty being I can't turn my back on any of them. It has become an absolutely untenable, unworkable situation if my goal is to teach them as a class. And this is where having administrative offices next door has been a huge advantage, because when I sent an email asking for some input, they were there the next day and looking at the situation as well as some of the other situations in the other exploratory classes. And so, and then on top of that, as far as the culture is concerned, I really have a sense for the first time that exploratory teachers are not seen as teaching content. and as such, we are not a priority. And that can be seen by the amount of time that we're giving in our team, which is half the time that any of the other teams are getting, which is also cut into our plan time. So it has not been a great start to this school year. And then on top of that, testing positive for COVID 5 days ago, and being sent home, is just. We'll end with that. We'll end with the picture of the lemons, and that's how I will close out this presentation, because this is essentially the life of most of the teachers in Curtis Middle School right now, especially the exploratory teachers. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.